She didn't decide to change. There was no resolution, no internal speech, no moment of discipline or pressure. She simply noticed that certain things no longer pulled at her. Old reactions didn't rise as fast. Old habits didn't comfort her anymore. Old patterns felt unfamiliar, almost unnecessary. She had not forced distance. She had grown it. For a long time, she believed change required effort, that leaving old patterns meant confrontation, resistance, control. But this time, nothing was forced. There was no struggle to let go, no inner argument, no guilt-driven discipline. She just didn't return. She realized then that the most lasting change does not come from pressure. It comes from formation. God had not asked her to break patterns through strength. He had reshaped her desires. What once sustained her emotionally no longer satisfied her spiritually. What once helped her cope no longer felt necessary. What once defined her rhythm no longer matched her pace. She didn't feel superior. She didn't feel finished. She felt different, quietly. And that difference made old patterns feel out of place. She understood something gently. When God changes the inside, the outside follows, without force. She had spent years trying to manage behavior. God had been shaping the heart, and now, leaving old patterns did not feel like loss. It felt like alignment. If you are in a season where certain habits, reactions, or ways of coping no longer fit who you're becoming, but you haven't had to fight them, stay. This message is for the woman who is learning that God's transformation does not always demand effort. Sometimes, it simply outgrows what no longer belongs. And if these words feel like they describe where you are right now, consider subscribing. Not for the channel, but so your heart always has a place to return. When growth feels quiet, unforced, and deeply real. Now, let's walk through how God helps us leave old patterns without forcing them, and why that kind of change lasts the longest. For a long time, those patterns had served a purpose. They helped her cope. They helped her survive. They filled gaps. When she didn't know what else to do, she used them to manage anxiety, to avoid pain, to feel some sense of control. When life felt uncertain, and because they worked then, she assumed they would always be necessary. But God does not remove coping mechanisms until He offers something deeper. She didn't stop those patterns. Through discipline, she stopped needing them. What once soothed her no longer brought relief. What once distracted her no longer felt helpful. What once gave her a sense of safety no longer calmed her heart. Not because the patterns were suddenly wrong, but because her inner landscape had changed. God had been slowly building a different source of stability. Through prayer that stayed, even when it felt dry. Through trust that endured, even without reassurance. Through faith that did not collapse when nothing changed. Those old patterns had been responses to fear, but fear no longer ruled her the same way. She noticed that moments that once triggered automatic reactions now passed differently. She paused, she breathed, she trusted, not consciously, naturally. And that is when she understood. God had not taken anything from her. He had replaced it. He had replaced coping with confidence, distraction with presence, control with trust. This kind of change does not feel like effort. It feels like relief, because forcing change creates tension, but formed change creates freedom. She didn't have to convince herself to leave old patterns behind. They simply no longer fit the person God was shaping. and that made leaving them gentle, almost inevitable. For years, change had felt like a battle, a constant effort to restrain reactions, to correct habits, to force herself to be better, calmer, stronger. She believed growth required tension, that if she wasn't struggling, she wasn't changing. So when the struggle stopped, she felt unsure. Was she becoming careless? Was she losing discipline? Was she drifting instead of growing? But what she discovered was different. She wasn't fighting less because she cared less. She was fighting less because there was less to fight. God had been addressing the root, not the behavior. The anxiety that once fueled her reactions no longer dominated her thoughts. The fear that once demanded control no longer dictated her choices. And without those inner pressures, the patterns lost their power. She realized that forcing change keeps us focused on ourselves, but formed change shifts our attention toward God. She was no longer monitoring every response, no longer correcting herself with harsh discipline, no longer exhausted by constant self-management. Instead, she was learning to trust what God had already done within her. This kind of change felt unfamiliar because it didn't require effort to maintain. It required surrender. Surrender to the truth that God's work is often deeper than our awareness. She learned to stop interrogating herself every time she felt calm, to stop questioning peace as if it were negligence. Peace was not laziness. It was evidence that something had been healed. God had not made her passive. He had made her free. Free from the internal battles that once defined her spiritual life. Free from the need to constantly prove growth. Free from the fear that she would regress if she relaxed. She began to trust that God's formation does not disappear when effort fades. It remains. And that realization allowed her to rest. Inside the change God had already completed. As she stopped fighting herself, she began to notice what had taken its place. Trust, not the kind she talked about, the kind she lived. She no longer needed to manage every outcome, no longer rehearsed conversations in her mind, no longer tried to anticipate every possible failure. Control had slowly loosened its grip, not because she decided to release it, but because she no longer needed it to feel safe. For a long time, control had been her way of surviving. If she could predict, she could protect. If she could manage, she could avoid pain. If she could stay alert, she could stay ahead of disappointment. But God had been teaching her a different way to live, a way that did not rely on constant vigilance. She realized that trust had quietly replaced control. In places she didn't even notice. She slept more peacefully. She reacted more slowly. She responded instead of rushing. Situations that once demanded immediate action now invited prayer instead. Not forced prayer, natural prayer. She no longer asked God to fix things quickly. She trusted Him to be present within them. This shift did not make her careless. It made her attentive. Attentive to God's presence instead of her own fear. Attentive to discernment instead of urgency. Attentive to peace instead of pressure. She learned that control creates the illusion of safety, but trust creates real security. God had not removed responsibility from her life. He had removed the burden of carrying everything alone, and that was freeing. She no longer felt responsible for outcomes God had never asked her to manage. She was faithful. She was available. She was obedient. The rest belonged to God. Leaving old patterns without forcing them meant trusting God to hold what she released. And He did. Quietly, faithfully, without asking her to fight her way into peace. There was a time when growth always felt heavy, like something she had to manage, maintain, protect. Growth meant vigilance, attention, effort. But now, growth felt different. It felt like peace, not the absence of difficulty, but the absence of inner resistance. She no longer felt at war with herself, no longer pressured to perform change, no longer afraid that relaxing would undo everything God had done. She realized that real growth does not demand constant attention. It sustains itself because it is rooted, not forced. God had not transformed her into someone who never struggled. He had transformed her into someone who no longer panicked at the presence of struggle. Old patterns didn't disappear because she fought them. They disappeared because she no longer needed them. And peace became the evidence. Peace in moments that once felt urgent. Peace in decisions that once required control. Peace in waiting without rehearsing fear. This peace was not emotional numbness. It was confidence without noise. She trusted what God had done in her, enough to stop managing herself. That was the final surrender. To believe that God's work was strong enough to stand without supervision. She stopped asking, "Am I doing this right?" and began living from the trust that God had already done something right within her. Growth no longer felt like pressure. It felt like alignment. In the end, she didn't leave old patterns by discipline. She outgrew them. She didn't resist them daily. She didn't fight them intentionally. She didn't force distance. She simply became someone who no longer needed them. God had changed her. Slowly, quietly, faithfully. So quietly that she didn't notice it happening. And that is often how God works. He reshapes the heart until behavior follows naturally. He heals fear until control loses its purpose. He builds trust until old patterns feel unnecessary. If you're in a season where certain habits, reactions, or ways of coping are quietly falling away without struggle, without force, let this be your reassurance. You are not losing discipline. You are gaining freedom. God is not making you careless, making you secure. And the change He forms this way is the kind that lasts. If you want a place to return, when growth feels quiet and transformation feels unforced, consider subscribing, not for the channel, but for your journey. Because when God changes you from the inside, you don't have to force the outside anymore.